Hi, and welcome back to PHP Security Pitfalls. In the previous video, we created generic server-side validation rules. Now, these are very similar to the rules you will find in frameworks such as Laravel, Zen Framework, or Symfony. And while generic validation is good, it's much better to be very strict and specific about what data to validate and when the input is considered valid. Take our login form, for example. Let's say a visitor can use it to log into one of two environments, backend and frontend. Tell you what, why don't I just go back to the form and add that hidden field right now. So we'll be an input with a type of hidden environment and we'll set the value to admin. Let's save that out. Now, a regular user is not aware of the hidden field being posted, of course, because he can't see it. But it's exactly what Mr. Malicious User is looking for. All that we need is a simple Firefox extension called Web Developer Toolbar right here. We'll just display form fields, like so. And now I can just tamper with the contents of this field and paste in my evil code in an attempt to empty the entire users table. Now this code, by the way, is SQL injection, and we'll learn more about that code in the next video. But anyway, if your application is vulnerable to SQL injection, then this code here will drop your entire users table. So you can imagine the harm that can come from leaving data like this unvalidated. Well, the bottom line is you should validate every input value your application uses. And you cannot be specific enough. Remember, if the data you receive does not match the specifications, it's bound to be tainted. So, let's improve upon our validation code some more. First off, we'll add the environment field to the rules array. Now, it will be required, but we'll also write a specific rule for this field, and we'll just call that environment. So now what we need to do is add that public method environment to our validation class, like so. Now, we don't want this rule to be generic. We want it to be very, very specific about what kind of values should be accepted. So we'll just create a variable called values, and that will be an array. Now, as we said before, there are only two kind of environments that we will allow, and that's admin and front end. And you can probably see where we're going here. Once more, we'll define a variable called valid, and it will only be valid if our value is passed here is indeed inside of the array values. So if it doesn't specifically match either admin or frontend, then this validation rule will fail. Now, while the validation rule is very specific, we don't want the error message to be too specific. So we'll just say the field name was not correct, like so. And then just to remind ourselves that in normal life, if we'd abort our login sequence, we'll just add a die statement and say abort. So let's just try and hack this form again. We'll just reload it and display the form details. Here we'll add some malicious gibberish and we'll just post it. And as you can see, the environment was not correct and everything's been aborted. Can we be even more specific? I think so. Let's just say this login form is specifically meant for employees of the company example.com. Now that means all the email addresses would end in @example.com. So why shouldn't we validate against that? Well, I think we should. So let's just add a rule to the email index and we'll just call that example. And then we'll also add another validation method for that called example. Okay, so what are we validating against? Well, we know that every email should end in example.com. So we'll just store that into a variable and let's call that string. And let's also make sure we spell it correctly. So in order to set our valid variable, we need to do something with this string. We need to compare this string to the last characters of the email address, which is stored in value. Now, to get the last characters of the email address, we'll just do a substring. We'll run it on that value, and then we won't start it at 0, but we'll start it at the position of the occurrence of this string here in our string value. So basically, this will mean that if @example.com is indeed equal to the last characters of the email address, then valid will be set to true, and if not, it will be set to false. Right, so let's just clean this up just a little. Remove this and make sure we set a different error message. And let's try this out. Okay, here we go. First of all, I'll set the email to joostvanveen.com and try log in, and there we get our error message, which is good. And then we'll just set it to joost@example.com and post it again, and there the error message is gone. All that's needed was a valid password, which we didn't provide. So you see, these rules are much more strict than the generic rules that we applied earlier. Now you could take this a step further as well, because you could check against the minimum length of a string, against the maximum length of a string, and a whole range of other rules. Well, the bottom line for validation is 1. Always validate server-side. 2. Validate all and any data that your application will use. 3. You cannot be too specific. If your string needs to contain example.com, make sure it contains example.com. If you are expecting an integer, do a check for isInteger. If you're expecting an array, do a check for isArray. Because really, if the data your application is receiving does not meet your specifications, it will most likely be tainted data. Now, there's one final thing that I would like to leave you with today, and that is blacklisting versus whitelisting. If you are doing data validation, always use a whitelist, never use a blacklist. Well, what is a whitelist? Well, this is whitelisting, ladies and gentlemen. Whitelisting is specifying all criteria that your data must match. Now that can be an array of values, or that could be a regular expression stating you can only pass in digits, whereas blacklisting checks if the input contains unacceptable data. And blacklisting is very dangerous because it relies on your anticipation of all the possible unexpected data. And since you are bound to forget one or two specifications, whitelisting is just so much more secure. Okay, with that we leave input validation. In the next video we'll be having a look at SQL injection. I'll see you there.